Have you ever thought about how America became, well, America? I mean, the modern version, a country of giant cities, massive industries, and incredible fortunes. Well, a huge piece of that puzzle was forged in a really intense period at the turn of the 20th century. We're talking about a time when skyscrapers were shooting up, but just a few streets over, people were living in absolute poverty. It was an age of incredible progress, but also brutal inequality. They called it the Gilded Age, and we're going to dive into how this wild, contradictory era built the country we know today.
You know, the name itself, Gilded Age, really gets to the heart of it. Was this a true golden age of innovation and opportunity? Or was it, just gilded, like a thin layer of shiny gold paint hiding some really deep cracks underneath? Things like corruption, poverty, and huge social problems. That's the big question we're going to explore. All right, so first things first, what actually built this engine of progress? What created all that wealth, whether it was real gold or just a shiny surface? Well, it really all boils down to one massive, unstoppable force: industrialization. Let's take a look at how this new America was literally built with fire and steel.
And if this new industrial America was a body, the railroads were its arteries and veins. Seriously, you can't overstate their importance. They weren't just about getting from point A to point B faster. They stitched the entire country together into one single giant market. All of a sudden, shipping costs plummeted, and they created this insane demand for coal, for steel, for machinery, which of course fueled even more growth. Everything, and I mean everything, was connected to the rails. So out of this new landscape, you get these absolute titans. I'm talking about guys like Andrew Carnegie in the steel business and John D. Rockefeller in oil. Their wealth and their power were just on a scale that nobody had ever seen before. But the thing is, they didn't just stumble into controlling entire industries. So how'd they do it? Well, it wasn't by accident, that's for sure. It was all by design. And a key tool in their toolbox was something called a trust. Now, this was a really clever setup. Here's how it worked. On paper, you'd have all these different companies that looked totally independent. But behind the scenes, a single board of trustees was calling all the shots for all of them. This let them act like one giant company that could just squash any competition and basically set whatever price it wanted. In other words, it was a monopoly.
And they used two different but equally brilliant and ruthless strategies to get there. Andrew Carnegie, he went with what's called vertical integration. He wanted to own every single step of making steel, from the mines where the iron ore came out of the ground, to the mills that forged it, to the railroads that shipped the final product. He owned the whole process. Now, Rockefeller did something different. He went horizontal. He didn't try to own everything. He just focused on owning one critical step: refining oil. And he either bought out or crushed every other oil refiner until he was basically the only game in town. Two different roads, but they both led to the same place: total control. But look, all this growth, all this mind-boggling wealth and power, it didn't just appear out of thin air. It came at a huge cost. And that price was paid by the people who were either standing in the way of all this progress or were the ones being crushed by the gears of the new industrial machine. For example, those same railroads that were carrying steel and grain were also carrying settlers ever westward, and that led directly to the tragic and systematic destruction of the Plains Indian cultures. I mean, just look at this timeline, and you can see how fast and how brutal it was. In 1876, you have the Battle of the Little Bighorn, which was this huge, final major victory for the tribes. But just 14 years later, the massacre at Wounded Knee happens, and it marks the tragic end of that resistance.
Now, at the same time, you have millions of immigrants pouring into the country, all looking for a better life. But the welcome they got was really a tale of two very different coasts. If you were a European immigrant coming through Ellis Island in New York, you might be processed and on your way in just a few hours. But if you were an Asian immigrant arriving at Angel Island out in California, it was a completely different and much crueler story. We're talking long, long detentions and intense interrogations, all designed to find any reason to send you back. And this wasn't just some official policy at the border, it was a reflection of the social climate all over the country. The fact is, a lot of these new immigrants were seen with just plain hostility and prejudice. They were considered other, a threat, and that feeling fueled discrimination everywhere. Meanwhile, down in the American South, a whole new system of racial oppression was being built, and it was getting the full backing of the highest court in the land. This all came to a head in 1896 with the Supreme Court's decision in a case called Plessy v. Ferguson. And believe me, this one case would go on to shape the lives of millions of Black Americans for generations. So, what the Plessy decision did was basically give the legal green light to what we now call Jim Crow laws. This was a whole system of laws at the state and local level designed to enforce total racial segregation. We're talking separate schools, separate train cars, even separate water fountains. And it was all built on this complete fiction of separate but equal. The reality, of course, was that it was a system of deep, brutal, and undeniable inequality. Okay, so with all of this injustice and all of these problems, you have to wonder, did anyone fight back? And the answer is a resounding yes. The excesses of the Gilded Age didn't go unnoticed. In fact, they sparked a huge, powerful wave of activism and reform that would become known as the Progressive Era. So who were these people? Who was fighting back against all this? Well, it wasn't just one group. It was journalists, it was activists, it was women, it was everyday citizens who just looked around at the world they were living in and decided, you know what, this has to change. One of the first waves of attack came from a group of investigative journalists who got this great nickname, muckrakers, and their whole mission was to expose the hidden filth of society. You had Upton Sinclair writing The Jungle, which showed people the absolutely horrifying things going on in meatpacking plants. You had Ida Tarbell, who fearlessly took on Rockefeller's giant oil trust, and Jacob Riis, who used his camera to literally show wealthy New Yorkers how the other half lives. Their work was so powerful, it made it impossible for the country to just look away anymore. And I have to say, women were at the absolute forefront of so many of these reform movements. I mean, they were leading the charge on multiple fronts all at once. They were fighting to ban alcohol through the temperance movement, they were demanding the right to vote in the suffrage movement, and they were creating settlement houses in poor urban areas to provide really critical social services. They were just undeniable engines of change. This fight for reform also moved into the political world. A lot of people felt the system was just corrupt and controlled by powerful political bosses. So, to break their grip, they pushed for these brand new tools for direct democracy. Things like the initiative, which let regular citizens propose a new law, the referendum, which let them vote directly on a law, and the recall, which gave them the power to remove a corrupt official from office. The whole goal here was simple: get the power out of the smoky back rooms and put it back into the hands of the people. So as America is going through all this change and reform on the inside, this newly supercharged, more confident nation also starts to look outward. It was getting ready to really flex its muscles and assert its power on the world stage. And you can see this big shift perfectly if you look at the change in foreign policy. For almost 100 years, the U.S. had the Monroe Doctrine. It was basically a simple warning to Europe: stay out of the Americas. But then, in 1904, President Teddy Roosevelt comes along and adds his corollary. And this thing completely flips the script. It didn't just say stay out anymore. It said, if there's a problem, we'll step in. America was now claiming the right to intervene directly in the business of its neighbors. Now, how did they justify this? Well, with this bold new idea: America as an international police power. The thinking went that the U.S. now had a kind of duty to maintain order in the Western Hemisphere, and if that meant using its military to manage the affairs of other countries, so be it. This was a huge, huge expansion of American ambition. And this wasn't just some theory they debated. No, this new policy was put directly into action to get the land needed for what would become one of the signature achievements of the entire era: the Panama Canal. This was America flexing its new power and reshaping not just other nations, but the actual geography of the planet. So we kind of end up right back where we started, don't we? With this really complex and contradictory legacy. The Gilded Age absolutely forged the modern, powerful, innovative America we know today, but it came at such a staggering human cost. And it really forces us to ask that same central question that they were grappling with back then, and maybe one we're still grappling with today. What is the true price of progress?